Just what is the spiritual meaning of the term beginning of sorrows that we find in the Olivet Discourse? And sorrows there means birth pains, but we see that they're defined as wars, famines, pestilences, and earthquakes. This is part 25 of the Olivet Discourse series. We've been working on a series of YouTube videos about the Olivet Discourse. This was a discourse when Jesus was on the Mount of Olives during the Passion Week. He spoke it to his disciples. The prophecy had to do with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Not one stone would be left upon another. The disciples, of course, had two questions. When will these temple buildings be destroyed? And secondly, what is the sign of the end of the world and the second coming? So the whole Olivet Discourse in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it had all together to do with which is known as the Great Tribulation. It's the time period of intense tribulation on the church prior to the second coming of Christ, and then also the last day and the second coming of Jesus Christ. Please consider subscribing to this channel. There's a little red button in the bottom right-hand corner. Before we move forward, just a quick review of prophecy, the order of events. The church age has gone from the time of the cross, some 2,000 years. Right at the end of that church age, which I believe we're in now, is the apostasy, of falling away from the church, which ushers in the Great Tribulation, that little season where it features the rise of the Antichrist. There's also false Christ, false prophets, the abomination of desolation, the church is Babylon. And we're looking in this video today about the beginning of sorrows, this period of the Great Tribulation. We're going to look at that. And then comes the last day, the second coming of Jesus Christ. It's the resurrection of the dead, the saved to go into eternal life in the new heavens, new earth. And the unsaved, it's judgment day, to be separated for God for eternity. Okay, so now let's look at the passage. And there's parallel passages in the Olivet Discourse in Mark 13, Luke 21, but we're going to read from Matthew 24. We see, you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for all these things which come to pass, but the end is not yet. And we're going to look at wars and rumors of wars in the next video. For nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and also there'll be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All of these, those four things, are the beginning of sorrows. And we're going to look, this beginning of sorrows, these four prophetic events, wars, famines, pestilences, earthquakes, we're going to look at that in upcoming videos. And this passage is just one of four parallel views of the Great Tribulation that is talked about in the Olivet Discourse. Now, the Olivet Discourse describes this period of time known as the Great Tribulation in four parallel views. They all end up with the last day of salvation or judgment, and that's very typical of prophecy throughout the Bible. The book of Revelation has 7 repeating or parallel views. The Old Testament, the same thing. We're working right now on view 1 about the beginning of birth pains. And we have other ones, view 2, the persecution of God's people. The abomination of desolation is coming up. The false teaching, the Great Tribulation. So for now, we're going to go and we're going to move on and we're going to dig into this thing about the beginning of birth pains. Now, the beginning of sorrows is really the beginning of birth pains. Matthew 24, the last sorrow or the last really points to the last day. And we're going to look at that in this video. There's some verses in the New Testament and also the Old Testament. But the beginning of those sorrows is really the Great Tribulation. The word beginning is the Greek art, which means commencement or first. And we're going to see throughout the series of the Olivet Discourse, the wars, the famines, the pestilence, and the earthquakes. There's 4 things that comprise the beginning of sorrows. When we look at that number 4 in prophecy has spiritual meaning. For example, we see these 4 events, but we also note in Ezekiel 14 that there's what's called 4 sword judgments of Ezekiel 14. Revelation features the number 4 extensively. There's 4 living beasts or cherubim. There's 4 angels. There's 4 horns of the altar. There's 4 quarters or parts of the earth. We've done a video, which I'll tag on the slide, that talks about how you determine the spiritual meaning of the number 4 and what it really means. It's universal or uttermost extent. Whether it's the distance in the world or the lands of the world, people, tribes, tongues, peoples, and nations, the work of angels and cherubim. Also, though, we see that the number 4 is tied in with the fullness or the universal extent of God's judgment, which includes the Great Tribulation and the last day. Let's look now in the New Testament symbolism of these sorrows. And again, sorrows, it can also be translated as birth pains or travail. And we see Matthew 24:8, the beginning of sorrows. That's the Greek word odin. And the words odin and odino are translated as pain, pangs, sorrows, travail. And we see there's a total of 7 occurrences of these words in the New Testament, and it always points to childbirth, the pain of childbirth, but most of the time it's used in a symbolic way. And we saw in Revelation 12:2, it talks about the woman in the wilderness, and she's in pain to be delivered, and she gives birth to a man-child. It's the first coming of Jesus Christ. And there's some other references to that in Isaiah 26. Awaiting the resurrection of Christ. Christ told us in John 16 about the disciples being in sorrow and basically in pain of childbirth until they see him again at the resurrection. Salvation of a Christian is referred to in the book of Galatians as bringing forth in childbirth. But notably, the second coming of Jesus Christ that we're looking at in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and also in 1 Thessalonians 5, talks about that last day. But we're going to see later in this video that it's also used relatively extensively in the Old Testament about the last day and Judgment Day. Now, of course, in the context of the Olivet Discourse, this beginning of sorrows points to the Great Tribulation and the last day, which is Judgment Day. When we compare in the Olivet Discourse the parallel passages of Matthew 24 and Luke 21, we can see that these beginning of sorrows includes the Great Tribulation and the last day. We're going to start here in Matthew 24. We already looked at those wars, there's famines, pestilence, earthquakes. All these things are the beginning of sorrows. They're included in the sorrows because they're the beginning, but the last sorrow is going to be Judgment Day, which we're going to look at many verses on that coming up. But when we look at the parallel passage in Luke 21, again, we see wars and earthquakes and famines and pestilence. And instead of these are the beginning of sorrows, it concludes and says, and fearful sights and great signs there shall be from heaven. Signs, great signs, fearful sights. And when we compare Luke 21 and Matthew 24, and we're going to look at this on the next slide, but we see that the sign was what the disciples asked, the sign of Christ coming, and it is those fearful sights and great signs which they have all together to do with the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, and the stars to fall. But let's look at and by looking at these in parallel, we can see that the sorrows have all together to do with the events of the Great Tribulation and the last day, because the sign of Christ returning on the last day are those fearful sights and great signs. The whole context of the Olivet Discourse is about the disciples asking questions. Jesus said there would be not one stone left upon another that won't be thrown down. And they said, well, what shall be the sign? And again, these great heavenly signs shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world. And we see that the sign, it's the Greek word semeion, it has altogether to do with like a signpost. It's an event, usually a historical event, or it could be a symbolic event that points to a more important spiritual truth. It's a sign. That's what a sign is. That's what it literally means. And we see in the context of the Olivet Discourse, the sign, the disciples are saying, what's the sign of your coming and the end of the world? Because it all happens at the last day. The sign of the end, and we've done a video on this, which I'll tag on this slide. There shall be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars. And in Matthew 24, Mark 13, it says, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give its light, the stars fall, the powers of heaven are shaken. That's the sign of Christ coming, because those all represent symbolically the end of time, the end of the gospel. It's the gospel's now complete. It's completed. It's done. Salvation's done. It's the last day. Christ is returned. So that's why it's called a sign, and it has altogether. And please take a look at the video that I'll post on this slide about the sun, the moon, and the stars. And so let's move on and look at why this has linkage to the Great Tribulation. When we look at Matthew 24:29, to remind ourselves, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, stars fall from heaven, the powers of the heavens are shaken. It's immediately after the tribulation, because that's the last day. That's the sign of the coming of Jesus Christ. That is the sign. And it's because it's the last day where immediately there's not going to be a sun, moon, or stars shining, because Christ is the light of the world. But they're all symbols of Judgment Day. So we see that the beginning of sorrows, again, just to not overemphasize this, it has to do with the Great Tribulation ushering up to the last day. So now let's look at more of these passages about the pains of childbirth and the Great Tribulation and the last day. We're going to look at some Old Testament passages as well in here, and we'll complete the video with that. Okay, first we see the last day as travail of children. We see that in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, and we've done a prophecy series on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, by the way. I'll tag a slide we've done on this slide. For when they say peace and safety, because the Great Tribulation is going to look like peace and safety. It looks like everything is going fine, because the Great Tribulation is actually on the church. And even the people in the church might not recognize it, because it's really, the suffering goes on by God's people who are afflicted by a fallen, broken down church called Babylon. But then sudden destruction comes upon them, because that's the last day. It says, travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape, pointing to Judgment Day. The peace and safety is a false salvation in this world. We also see even more clearly in Isaiah 13. They shall be afraid. And this is, Isaiah 13 is talking about the last day. It's talking about Judgment Day. They shall be afraid. Pangs and sorrows shall take hold of them. They shall be in pain as a woman that travails. Their faces shall be as flames, pointing to flames of fire of judgment. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel, both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it. That is all symbolic language for the last day. It's like a day of the pains of childbirth. We also see in Jeremiah 50 and Revelation 18 the king and queen of Babylon, because they will be affected by Judgment Day. They will be judged on that day. Jeremiah 50, the king of Babylon has heard the report of them. His hands waxed feeble. Anguish took hold of him, and pangs as a woman in travail, because it's the last day. It's Judgment Day. The king of Babylon is a type of the Antichrist that exists in the Great Tribulation. Revelation 18:7, Babylon is the church of the Great Tribulation. She's a harlot. She commits spiritual fornication with all the people in the world. How much has she glorified herself, just like the church even today is glorifying itself? Live deliciously, so much torment and sorrow give her. For she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, I'm no widow, and I shall see no sorrow. And again, it's that Greek word Odin. She won't see any pains of childbirth. And again, the queen of Babylon is a type of the false Christian church. Another example of the pains of childbirth being a symbolic language for judgment, we see it on the judgment of the king of Judah, Jehoiakim. He was the king, one of the kings during the Babylonian captivity. We looked at the Babylonian captivity in the last video, and we saw that it was a type of the Great Tribulation. Jeremiah 22, verses 21 to 23, I spoke to you in your prosperity. I will not, but you said, I will not hear. This has been thy manner from thy youth, that you obey not my voice. He was a wicked king, Jehoiakim. He's a symbolic represent because he was essentially presiding over God's people at the time. He was the king. He was a false Christ, a false king, because he wasn't faithful to God. And the wind shall eat up all thy pastors, your shepherds, just like the church today, during the Great Tribulation, the church today will follow the Antichrist, and thy pastors will receive judgment. Thy lovers shall go into captivity. Surely thou shalt be ashamed and confounded for all your wickedness. And O inhabitant of Lebanon, that makes your nest in the cedars, he was proud, and he thought he was rich, and he thought he was safe. How gracious shall you be when pangs come upon thee. The pain is a woman in travail. It's the judgment, again, on the king of Judah, Jehoiakim, during the Babylonian captivity. Birth pangs, the day of Jacob's trouble. Again, Jacob's trouble, Jeremiah 30, it's pointing to those days of the Babylonian captivity. It's a warning for Jacob. And we see in Jeremiah 30, the whole chapter talks about the day of Jacob's trouble, and it's pointing all together to do with the last day and with Judgment Day and the events coming up to that, which is the Babylonian captivity. Thus says the Lord, we have heard a voice of trembling, of fear, and not of peace. Not of peace. Ask now and see whether a man does travail with child. Wherefore do I see every man with his hands on his loins as a woman in travail? Because it's that great tribulation. It's that beginning of sorrows. It's the wars and the famines and the pestilences and the earthquakes. All symbolic language. All faces are turned into paleness. Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble. Jacob is a symbolic reference to God's chosen people, his elect people that are suffering in great tribulation in that false Babylonian church that is taking captivity, God's people captivity. But he shall be saved out of it on the day of the last day, the day of salvation. Again, the woman in travail here points to the great tribulation of God's people, and it points ultimately to Judgment Day. We also see in Isaiah 42, the Lord shall go forth as a mighty man. He shall stir up jealousy like a man of war. He shall cry, yea, roar. He shall prevail against his enemies. Symbolic language of Judgment Day. God's vengeance, the day of vengeance and judgment. I've long time holding my peace. God is patient, not wishing that any of his elect shall perish, waiting for the last elect person to be saved. I've been still and refrained myself. Now I will cry like a travailing woman. I will destroy and devour at once, because it's a symbol for the last day, Judgment Day. I will make waste mountains and hills and dry up their herbs, and I will make the rivers islands. I will dry up the pools. All symbolic language for the last day of judgment. Micah 4, the travail before the last day. Micah is very parallel to the book of Isaiah. It's an earlier prophet before the Babylonian captivity. In the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established. He shall judge amongst many people. Neither shall they learn war anymore. In that day will I gather her that is driven out. All this points to the last day of salvation, the ushering in of eternity, the gathering God's people that have been driven out by the Babylonian captivity. I will make her that was cast far off a strong nation. We're the nation of God for eternity. We're going to reign as kings and priests. The Lord shall reign over them in Mount Zion from henceforth even forever. This is talking about the last day of eternity, the last day ushering in an eternity where there is no time. And God's people reign with Christ. And we see, though, just a couple verses later, just before that time, pangs have taken thee as a woman in travail. Be in pain and labor to bring forth. It's to bring forth this last day. O daughter of Zion, like a woman in travail. For now thou shalt go even to Babylon. That's the great tribulation. That's the beginning of sorrows. But there thou shalt be delivered. You should be delivered of this pain and ushered. You should be redeemed from the hand of thine enemies. And that brings in the beautiful eternity with God. Just a quick summary of this video, the beginning of sorrows. Sorrows points to the pain of childbirth. It's a symbol for the trials of the Great Tribulation that God's people will go through. And it's even today, we see the beginnings of that already. The church is breaking down, it's crumbling. And it all ushers in the judgment on the last day, which ushers in the eternity. The Micah 4 is a beautiful passage of scripture that illustrates this very nicely. So now we're going to move into other videos. We're going to do videos on these wars and rumors of wars, famine, pestilence, earthquakes. So you want to keep up with it, please consider subscribing to this channel, and thank you for watching this video.